this is a response, very tangentially, to Fred's wonderful video, that's Conference Reports video called Sloppy Research. And I found that video very right-minded. It was so much of, I think, the kinds of things that I want to rally behind and say, look, man, we're here on YouTube, we're chit-chatting. This is a place to have, yeah, steam from the half bakery. This is quick, loose, off-the-cuff discussion that we're having. I think for more serious, carefully stated arguments, you need other media of communication. Okay, so that is the real point that I would want to say there. With that as my context, if I can just say, okay, let's grant something like that this is off the cuff and loose. I want to respond to, I think, some of the concerns that have been aired over my statements about the fact that I believe, to the best of my knowledge, that there is no life after death. Now, I want to stress again that I do not know. I'm not claiming to say, look, I know for a fact there is no life after death and there's no such thing as a trans-empirical consciousness and everything else. From my own perspective, all of this stuff has been deeply, deeply misunderstood, and the basic mythological structure, the language structure that has been embedded in the history of talk about this is basically not been understood except by various few thinkers. And what I want to do is say, look, I think if you look at certain people, and it is people like Douglas Harding, it is people like Alan Watts, it's people like Joseph Campbell and Heinrich Zimmer, and I think what they're trying to suggest to us is that we need to understand ourselves as mythical beings who in our histories have created various kinds of stories and accounts that are they're kinds of psychological advice. They're not to be understood as factually true. Okay. What I want to say, I realize I'm probably all over the place here. So I guess what I want to say is that there are two rough doctrines that could be described, and maybe this will help ease some of the concerns for those people who get all riled over the afterlife stuff. And this would be I guess the beef that I would want to raise, is that there are people who have confused the two basic doctrines of what could be called sort of mystical sects of Christianity. There is one doctrine that could be called the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, and it's based on this principle of a kind of consciousness that is deep down, that is, I guess it's Aristotelian. It goes down to the, every sperm is sacred sort of stuff, where, when an individual baby is made, I guess for the homunculi, for Aristotle is a little bit different, but this notion here that there is some kind of soul, I guess, that comes into being or is brought down from somewhere. I'm not sure how all this stuff works, but I think the basic concept here is that people who operate by this orientation of doctrine, of the personal, of the immortality of the soul, they have a notion of the personal consciousness, and then from there they think that life is a sort of relation of the finite to the infinite. This is the kind of relationship that they think about. It's the finite to the infinite. And I think they start to think of time itself as if it were beads on a string, and the imagined afterlife is some kind of ongoing infinity of moments of now added onto, so one moment of now, another moment of now. And then their notion of the afterlife actually is a kind of what I would call bad infinity, but this notion of beads on a string, or a sequence of nows additively accumulating. That is all very, very different than what could be called the doctrine of life eternal. If I say there's a doctrine of life eternal, what I'm talking about here is the notion it's more what I've tried to align myself with. I do find those mystic Christian traditions which are giving explicitly metaphorical and allegorical stories, and it's aligning with something like a doctrine of life eternal, which says, look, Life is all that anyone has ever known. It's all you've ever known. Try to draw the line between what you know and what everything that's in the world. Well, that's just you in your head drawing that line again. I mean, to really come to terms with the extent to which you are not solipsistically locked inside your own mind. I mean, if anything, you've emerged out of the world, you're a place and moment of it, but there is a deep, deep sense in which life is all that anyone has ever known, and even the ideas that we have where we're trying to entertain non-life or other possibilities, those come from life. They've come from the stories that we've heard, or even from an imagination that has been I guess, grown out of this world. Now, if the doctrine of the immortality of the soul aligns to something like the infinite and the finite, those are the two operators. When you move to the doctrine of life eternal, the eternal has its opposite as the temporal. That's right. The eternal and the temporal. And so the issue is to address how the human being, though temporal, always has a taste of the eternal. I have tried to suggest in many, many cases here that it's language. And language is the tree in the garden. Language is the fruit. Language was the fall. And language is both continuous with nature, but it became a difference of degree that then was a difference of kind. And it unleashed great, I guess, scopes of immediacy, ranges of care, the sheer, I don't know, the scope and magnitude of space and time that were opened through language. This is what maybe I would try to get at when I'm talking about this notion of the eternal. And to say that humanity is a kind of fall. We're the dumb animal. We're the animal that's most plastic. We're the animal that's most subject to its own tampering. If anything, other animals have been spared from their own kind of spellbinding in the way that we have been open to it. We're an animal who both, maturationally depends upon acculturation, but in general, linguistic capacities mean that the person comes to see the world largely constrained through the kinds of categories that they use. I thought it was funny, my last video, I posted this response to a Jama Flipper, and I said, are you basically, now pick one if you had to pick one, just for argument's sake, if you had to pick one, are you basically a human on the planet? Are you an animal from the planet? Are you place and moment of the planet? And it was funny, the number of people who say, well, I want to say it's all three. Well, you could say that it's all three, but those difference between on, from, and of don't really allow you to meditate upon what each of those means simultaneously, because there's a great difference between saying on and of. See, you can try to say on. See, I've noticed this just in the language. See, the language that I've heard people use, and this is certainly Gary's language, is this machine language. And then I've heard Ojama Flipper say things like, well, it's evolutionary process that created us as these machines. And it makes it seem like right now there are these free-floating, independent machines that are simply on this other thing called the planet. I have been trying to rail against this as much as I can. It's as if your eyes are fooling you. You can't see the air, but you're dependent upon it right now. You're not actually independent. See, a machine doesn't have a metabolism. A machine doesn't need to transpire with its environment. It doesn't have a need for respiration. The machine metaphor is such a bad metaphor. And it's a metaphor. At any rate, language is the fall that occurred to humanity. Now, how it happened, I have no idea. Was it Terence McKenna? Was it a bunch of mushrooms? Maybe. Was it a long, long, convoluted history of forms of writing and other kinds of technology and fire and cooking of food and all this kind of stuff? Who knows? I mean, it just seems very strange. If anything, I can imagine, I can well imagine that for millions of years, okay, for millions of years, and I'm giving steam from the half bakery here, millions of years, humans, those humanoids who were becoming humans, that sort of, that missing link sort of thing, they probably celebrated every day as the utter miracle that it is. They woke up and went, oh my, the sun, and they freaked out and went, holy cow, and with great excitement, the way your dog greets the morning. And as the day proceeded, to try to think of what time is without syntax and without calendars and without all the ways that we have made time sit still with the cultural practices, largely through language, that have changed our experience of time. Okay, so that's, and this is, okay, this is where we're getting this issue of the temporal and the eternal, right? Don't go to the finite and infinite. That's going to lead you into this weird notion of immortality of the soul and this kind of inward stuff. No, 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 no. Consciousness is something that the universe is doing. It's something that's come to roost in you through various socio-historical, chemical, biological processes, but it's diffusely located throughout the world, throughout the world itself. Language, again, opens us to the eternal. Okay, it is a symptom of the eternal in the temporal. And the eternal gets open to in two different ways. One is by the ecstasies of communication. Again, those are only called ecstasies, is kind of a Heideggerian term. And it means the fact that speech and language is always a tarrying. It's a retaining that awaits. It's a gathering along that can leap ahead and yet also reach back. The degree to which we can talk about yesterday or 5 years ago or even the origin of the universe, and the degree to which we can talk about and I can make a plan for what I'll do tomorrow or 5 years from now, or I can even make a plan for what I'm going to do 100 years from now, or how I'm going to try to make sure I have a college fund for my children and all this kind of stuff. I can leave a legacy. I may even try to predict the end of the solar system by when the sun goes supernova. These kinds of capacities in language, they're ecstasies, they're capacities to reach outside of the now, the sort of now that particles or inorganic matter, we could say, without any sense of space or time, they're just located at wherever they're at, and it's sort of a point that we can't even say is right now. This is where quantum mechanics sort of gets interesting. Okay, but at any rate, humans have syntax, and we have the ecstatical capacities that come with language that allow us to speak about what is to be and also to speak about what was. When we move to another aspect of language, which is even more important and upon which that relies, it's that language trades in essences. Language doesn't trade in materiality in the same way. Now, certainly it requires materiality. Yes, I don't misunderstand me. I'm admitting a sort of physicalist, materialist orientation. But sound is a very odd phenomena. I've tried to suggest at several points. Irving Goffman has a line. He says, of all of the things of this world, information is the hardest to guard because it can be stolen without removing it. This point, that information can be stolen without removing it, shows that information, or those essences that get employed through language, they're not subject to entropy in the same way that, again, materiality is. Materiality has, what we say, when I look at this, there are visual forms that allow me to call it a cup and then to recognize that cup is similar to this cup. But the word cup, each time I say it, if I have 5 different people say the word cup, It's 5 different words, 5 different I'm sorry, it's the same word, but it's different pronunciations, different intonations, different pitches. The ability to see that sameness across differences, that ability to identify what is the word across fonts. I mean, look at all of the different fonts, and yet you can recognize the same word despite all those fonts. You might even recognize the same word despite a misspelling in there. Well, that's this sort of working with something like an essence. It's something that it's not that it's essential in some beardy pulley way. It means that it's non-temporal. See, the eternal is to be set in contrast with the temporal. The more that people deal with the eternal temporal, the more that we can start to realize that language somehow both opens us to time, that is, it gets us out of the now and gets us an orientation toward radical futures and radical pasts, but it also has the very taste of the eternal in language itself. Words don't rot. If I set an orange on a table in, a couple of weeks or a month, that thing will be very nasty. But the word orange, it doesn't ever rot. Now, it may change, but once it changes, the fact of what it used to be, is there decay there? What is the status of a word's decay? Okay, I think those would maybe be enough of a very digressive video. I apologize for all this. I think that was maybe somewhat of a summation of some of the concerns I've been having lately. I do think, though, that for those people who are all concerned about if there is no life after death, and maybe there isn't, right? Let's just say for argument's sake, that there is no life after death. I would want to say to those people who are Christians, can you forgive the cosmos for having evolved beings who can have all of this, but they were destined to die? I think if you feel like it's a cruel hoax or that's really not fair, how dare to be conscious, how dare to be aware and to have a self and to have a name and a history and to have all these loves and to have all that robbed from you in the end. I want to say, first, it was all on loan to begin with. You're not really who you think you are. You're not a personal consciousness deep down inside your body. You're a manifestation of this cosmos itself. And this would be my opinion. I'm not trying to give you a fact. This is sloppy research here. And I would also want to add that there's no real fear over death. I think the more that you realize that you've been tasting eternity as long as you've been thinking and talking to yourself and talking with other people, by the time that you came to self-awareness, you were already that being who was partaking in the eternal. Now, I'm not suggesting here that other animals aren't eternal and all this kind of stuff. I'm using a bunch of metaphors to try to get at the way that humans somehow have been altered in their experience of time. Okay, thank you.